The code was also intended to restore trust in travel because I think that during the pandemic, most of us realized how vulnerable we are as consumers when we travel. And also there was a lot of uncertainty about what are our rights when we travel and so many disparities.
Hello, this is the Weekly Tradecast, a podcast brought to you by UN Trade and Development. I'm Sarah Toms. We're exploring how major events are shaping trade and development and how that affects billions of people around the world. This week, with the summer holidays starting, we're looking at travel and consumer protection rights. With millions of people on the move around the world, many holidaymakers have no idea of their rights or the protections in place when something goes wrong. During the COVID-19 pandemic, millions of flights were cancelled. The closure of borders with little or no notice left millions of tourists stranded abroad, many without assistance or enough money for a long, unexpected stay. The crisis exposed the disparities of consumer rights from country to country, highlighting the need for an international legal framework to help tourists in distress. Tourism is worth nearly $10 trillion and provides work for more than 1 in 10 people. So there's an economic urgency to keeping the industry moving and consumers confident, especially in developing countries where tourism can make up a major part of the economy. An international code to protect tourists created by the UN offers better legal support in a world with new risks from technology. Here to tell us more about the UN Code and why we need it is Alicia Gomez, Legal Counsel at UN World Tourism Organization. Alicia actually led the development process of the International Code. Welcome to the show today, Alicia.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Great. Well, the very aptly named International Code for the Protection of Tourists, created by the UN, the ICPT for short, tell us a little bit more about what the code is and what it does. As a traveller, what should I expect and know?
The code is the first global instrument to provide protection to tourists in emergency situations, not limited to a pandemic. So it could be a natural disaster, it could be a conflict. We live in an increasingly volatile world and governments need to be prepared to provide basic assistance to tourists if these situations happen. And at the same time, it also harmonizes minimum standards for the protection of tourists as consumers in their contractual relations with tourism service providers.
What are the limits of the protections then, and how is the code enforced? For instance, how many countries are part of the code?
The code is a soft law instrument, meaning it is not an international convention, it is not an international treaty, it is not legally binding. However, when countries adhere to the code, they commit to integrate the code into their national legislations. So once a country has integrated the code into their national legislation, then the code will actually become legally enforceable in that territory.
Right.
We have 24 countries that have adhered to the code, and we have many more that are in the process of adhering.
Oh, and what kind of legal protection would you get? Give us a real-world example of how this code would protect me as a tourist.
Well, in such large events, what can happen to you as a tourist is, for example, that you do not have access to the museum that you had previously booked because there are too many tourists that day. So would you get a refund? Yes, in accordance with the code, you would have the right to get a refund. And then at the same time, if you would not be refunded and you would need to claim, let's say, in a tribunal, well, the code foresees that instead of having to go to traditional litigation, you could sort this issue through alternative dispute mechanisms, let's say mediation, amicable settlement, conciliation, arbitration, and these mechanisms can even take place online, which makes it much more convenient for a tourist to do that when he or she has returned to their home country.
Now, tourism is such a vital sector for many developing countries, and many of them took a big hit during the pandemic and the cost of living crisis. So how does this code connect with the recovery of the tourism sector when so many countries and millions of people, particularly in developing countries, really depend on it?
Tourism is an economic sector. It is also a social sector that employs a lot of people in the world. And definitely the code was also intended to restore trust in travel, because I think that during the pandemic, most of us realize how vulnerable we are as consumers when we travel. And also there was a lot of uncertainty about what are our rights when we travel, and so many disparities. So this facilitates our travel. And by facilitating travel, we are reactivating a sector that is very important for the economies of the world.
Now, you mentioned COVID. The crisis now is largely over for most travellers. So where are the new risks, dangers and challenges for travellers?
We all purchase more and more our travels in online tourism markets, and we have observed very alarming increase of fraudulent schemes and the scams in these online markets that target specifically tourists.
Oh, right.
So if tourists are already vulnerable, they are hyper vulnerable in these online markets, and often platforms are the ones that disseminate deceitful advertisements or social media. So for a tourist, it becomes extremely difficult to actually know if an offer is too good to be true, or if actually the offer is legal and will be complied with.
So, Alicia, tell me a little bit more about the kind of scams we're now seeing.
Well, one of the typical scams are hotels that don't exist, for example. So when you arrive to your dream destination, you will find out that your dream hotel actually doesn't exist. And then, well, you find yourself in another country with your holidays becoming an absolute hell, and with your money gone at the same time. And also we find a lot of the online markets to make sure that they are safe and reliable and accountable, but also the online tourism service providers, social media, the platforms that disseminate this information should also have some responsibility into making sure that they are not disseminating illegal content.
Right. And why are these scams on the rise now?
One of the reasons why they are on the rise is, of course, the massive use of tourism online markets. I mean, we've all changed the way in which we book and purchase our travels. So, of course, the scammers go to these places to make their business, but also because there are no reporting mechanisms established in all the countries. There's no international data on how many scams, how many fraudulent schemes exist in these online tourism markets. And at the same time, tourists are normally, when they fall for these scams, they are usually ashamed of reporting. There is a sense of shame because they feel it was their responsibility. And so they hardly ever report it. Also, these scams usually target the most senior groups, the most vulnerable groups, the senior, the juniors, individuals also with accessibility problems.
We have the ICPT now, but is it enough? What are the next big steps that you're seeing?
I think that at least from UN Tourism, our next big step is to have more countries adhering to the code. We have 24, which is a very good number after only 2 years of the code living, but we need more countries so that this becomes really an international legal framework, and also that the countries that have adhered can share their practices, can share lessons learned too. So that they can continue improving. There are also issues that are coming, like issues related to over-tourism, issues related to greenwashing in tourism. So I believe that these should also be included in the code. The code is a living instrument, so we can continue building and adapting it to the evolution of the tourism market.
Spending on tourism's jumped again last year. I think it was 18% stronger than in 2019 before COVID. How can we keep growth and investment going into the tourism sector in a sustainable way that also aligns with the benefits of trade and development? It's a big ask, isn't it?
Yes, that is the constant balance that we have to do in the organization. In fact, we are talking about tourism consumer protection, but we also need to talk about the responsibility of travelers whenever we visit a place to minimize all the negative impacts on tourism and on the destinations that we visit, not only on the environment, but also on the cultural, the historic heritage. and also the impact that we leave to the host communities.
Mm.
UN Trade and Development is the UN organization that is responsible for consumer protection, whereas UN Tourism is the specialized agency of the United Nations responsible for tourism. So our two mandates absolutely merge here for joint efforts around building sustainable tourism practices and a better consumer protection for tourists.
Right. And let's hope more members join the code. Thank you so much, Alicia. That was really interesting. That was UN's Alicia Gomez, who was this week's guest. Tune into the weekly Tradecast next week and every week for more insights on the most pressing issues around the world of trade and development. And there's even more on our website, unctad.org. I'm Sarah Toms in Geneva. Goodbye for now.